We've all been there. Those days where you just feel unhappy or anxious or maybe totally overwhelmed. Life can feel like this huge, painful uphill battle sometimes. And that's just part of being human. But it begs the question, right? At what point do those very common struggles cross a line? When do they become something more, something we might actually call a disorder?
The famous psychologist Carl Jung put it so well. He basically said that struggle is part of what makes us whole, and that really gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? It's this massive question that psychologists have been wrestling with forever. Where exactly is that line? How do we tell the difference between a normal, healthy dark side and something that's actually genuinely hurting us? Well, today, we're going to try to map that out. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle what abnormal behavior even means. Then, we'll look at a big debate in the field. After that, a quick trip through history, a look at modern explanations, and finally, we'll see how it all connects.
All right, let's jump right in. Section 1. What is abnormal behavior? When a psychologist uses that word abnormal, they're not just talking about being a little quirky or feeling a bit off. Nope. They've actually got a pretty specific toolkit they use to identify when a struggle might be tipping over into something more serious.
And that toolkit, it's often called the 4Ds. It's a really handy framework. So first up is deviance. Basically, is the behavior way outside of what's considered normal in a given culture. Next, you've got distress. Is it causing a lot of pain or anxiety, either for the person themselves or for others? Then there's dysfunction. This one's huge. Is it messing with their ability to live their life, to work, to go to school, to have healthy relationships? And finally, danger. Is the behavior a risk to the person or to anyone else? And here's the really important part. It's almost never just one of these things. It's when you start seeing a combination of these Ds that the red flags really start to go up.
Okay, so even with a neat framework like the 4Ds, there's this huge debate simmering underneath it all. And it really comes down to this. Is something abnormal just because it breaks society's rules, or is it because it's genuinely hurting a person's ability to live a good life? This is a really fundamental question in psychology.
And this really breaks down those two viewpoints. On the one hand, you've got the deviation from social norms perspective. This says, look, behavior is abnormal if it goes against the rules, written or unwritten, of a society. But you got to ask, what if society's rules are the problem? Then, on the other hand, you have the maladaptive behavior view. This is all about well-being. It asks a totally different question. Is this behavior getting in the way of a person's growth and happiness? And from this angle, you could argue that someone who fits in perfectly could still have a problem if it's completely crushing their soul,
Now, our ideas about all this stuff, they haven't always been so, nuanced. To really get it, we need to take a quick look back in time. It has been a wild journey, from evil spirits to modern science.
So for a huge chunk of history, the go-to explanation was pretty simple. Evil spirits. Seriously, in the ancient world, and especially the Middle Ages, demonology was the leading theory. Now, the ancient Greeks did have some early biological ideas, like the four humors being out of balance. But that whole demonic possession thing really took over. And, well, that led to some pretty dark stuff, like witch hunts. But then things started to shift. During the Renaissance, there was this move toward humanism, focusing more on psychological conflict. And that change in thinking slowly paved the way for the age of reason and a more scientific approach, which brings us to the modern era.
And that brings us to our modern way of looking at this, which is known as the biopsychosocial model. It's a big name, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's all about looking at the whole picture. It recognizes that there's no single, simple cause for psychological disorders. Instead, it's almost always an interaction between three key areas. First up, you have the bio part. This is all about our biology, our physical makeup. Think of it as the body's hardware. We're talking about things like faulty genes, hormone imbalances, or issues with brain chemicals, neurotransmitters like serotonin or dopamine. For example, we know there's a link between low serotonin activity and depression, or too much dopamine activity and schizophrenia. So our biology definitely plays a part.
Next, we have the psycho part. If biology is the hardware, this is kind of like the software. It's our internal world. This looks at our thoughts, our feelings, and all our past learning experiences. It asks those deep questions, like, are there old conflicts from childhood that are still running the show? Have we learned behaviors that just aren't working for us anymore? Are our own thought patterns tripping us up? All that internal stuff can be a massive piece of the puzzle.
And last but not least, there's the sociocultural part. This is the world we live in. It's our family, our friends, our community, our culture. Things like your family structure, whether you have a solid support network, and even the labels society slaps on people, it all has a huge impact. I mean, being isolated or stuck in a really tough family situation, that creates stress, and that stress can absolutely contribute to problems.
So, we've got these three big pieces of the puzzle: bio, psycho, and social. But the million-dollar question is, how do they actually work together to lead to a disorder? Well, there's a fantastic model that really helps connect all those dots.
And it all starts with something called a diathesis. It's a technical-sounding word, but just think of it as a pre-existing vulnerability. It's often genetic, but it's basically some kind of biological predisposition that puts someone at a higher risk for a particular disorder. You can think of it like a loaded gun. But of course, a loaded gun doesn't just go off on its own, right? That vulnerability, that diathesis, it needs a trigger. And that's where pathogenic stressors come in. That's just a fancy term for significant life stress. It could be a traumatic event, a really difficult environment. This is the stuff that pulls the trigger. And here's the formula, plain and simple. You take that pre-existing vulnerability, the diathesis, and you add a major stressor from the environment. And what do you get? The potential for a disorder to develop. This is so important because it shows us that it's almost never just nature or nurture. It's the complex, dynamic dance between the two. Okay, let's wrap this up with the key takeaways. What's the bottom line? First, abnormal isn't some vague judgmental label. It's a framework, the 4 Ds, involving real distress and dysfunction. Second, our understanding has come a long way from demons and superstitions to a real scientific, multifaceted approach. Third, the biopsychosocial model shows us that our bodies, our minds, and our world are all connected. And finally, the diathesis stress model gives us that beautiful explanation for how vulnerability and life's challenges can interact.
And all of this leaves us with a final, really important thought. Once you understand this complex interplay of factors, it totally reframes the whole idea of mental illness, doesn't it? It's not a character flaw. It's not about being crazy. It's a health issue, plain and simple, rooted in biology, psychology, and life experience. So the real question for all of us is this: now that we know better, how can we use this knowledge to change the conversation around mental health for good?